Hey guys, it's Yuta. So this video is about Yare Yare Daze
Yare Yare Daze.
and Yare Yare Dawa.
Yare Yare Dawa.
I'm going to explain Daze and Dawa because I've already explained Yare Yare in another video. But in short, Yare Yare is an exclamation that expresses a mix of relief, annoyance, and mild dismissal without being too serious. It's often translated as good grief, which I think is a pretty good translation. But daze can't be fully translated because English doesn't have the same thing. Ze is a type of word we call a particle. Particles normally add nuances to a sentence without fundamentally changing the meaning. Japanese isn't the only language that has particles, but I have the impression that particles in Japanese tend to be very elaborated. Da isn't a straightforward word either, but in this particular example, it's actually pretty easy to explain because da exists purely for grammatical reasons. You simply need da to connect ze to nouns and not adjectives. Yare yare is actually an exclamation, but here you're treating it like a noun. It's easy because you don't have any other choice. Having choice is what makes things difficult in life. Should I eat udon? Should I eat soba? Life is difficult when you have choices. So, what is ze? Ze is kind of a masculine particle that makes sentences sound masculine. So, compared to just saying yare yare, saying yare yare daze sounds a bit more masculine. But that's not the only thing that ze does to a sentence. There's much more to it. It also makes sentences sound conversational. We don't use particles like ze when we write an essay, unless we want to make it sound conversational. Ze also sometimes implies that you're sharing information that the other person doesn't necessarily know. Let me give you a sentence using the word asa, morning. You can say, asa daze, it's morning. And it sounds almost like you are announcing that it's morning because the other person doesn't know. So this is a good sentence to use when you are waking up somebody. Asa daze, wake up. But let's flip the situation and say you're the one who is asleep. Somebody is trying to wake you up saying asa daze, and you want to ask, what? Is it morning? In this case, you'd say something like, asa? What? Is it morning? But you wouldn't say, asa daze, unless you want to say something like, what do you mean it's morning? So using ze adds a lot of nuances other than make it sound masculine. The closest gender-neutral particle I can think of is yo. Instead of saying asa daze, you can also say asa da yo, and it has more or less the same meaning except that it sounds gender-neutral. Mattaku yare yare da yo. Now, let's talk about wa in yare yare da wa. Wa makes a sentence sound feminine, which makes sense because Jolene is a woman. But that's not the only difference between ze and wa. I've shown you the sentence asa daze, and you can also say asa da wa, but if you say asa da wa, it doesn't quite sound like you are announcing that it's morning. It sounds more like you are saying that to yourself when you realize that it's already morning. Oh, it's morning. Asa da wa. It doesn't have the same nuances. If this sounds a bit subtle, let me give you an example where you can use ze but you can't use wa. I'm gonna use the sentence iko, let's go. You can perfectly add ze and say iko ze, let's go. But you can't add wa and say iko wa because iko wa simply sounds incorrect. The difference between ze and wa is more than just being masculine or feminine. And you can't really translate these nuances into English because English and Japanese are different languages, and each language has different features. So if you want to fully understand what Japanese people or anime characters are saying, you just have to learn Japanese. And if you want to learn Japanese with me, I will teach you the kind of Japanese that Japanese people today actually speak, because it can be different from the kind of Japanese that textbooks teach you. So click the link in the description. Now, I want to ask a different question. Do real-life Japanese people use ze and wa? The answer is yes, but not everybody. Let's start with ze. Even though not everybody uses it, some people do use it sometimes. It's mostly boys and men who want to sound rough. And they use it in a casual situation, so maybe when they are talking to their friends. And also some women actually use it sometimes, even though the number is much smaller compared to men, because it's primarily masculine. But I've known a few girls who sometimes used it. And there are actually female anime characters who use ze. And when a woman uses it, people won't question their sexual and gender identity. But how about wa? First of all, most women today don't speak in a stereotypically feminine way. They don't usually use wa, and when they do it sparingly. It's probably much less common than ze in real life, even though anime characters use it all the time. And cis straight men don't use it. The only time they use it is when they try to act stereotypically feminine. For example, when they are cross-dressing maybe. This means that when a man uses it, people won't think they are cis and straight. They will probably think they are a particularly feminine kind of gay man. And I've come across a few people like that, and it's pretty obvious they weren't cis and straight. But you have to be careful with wa, because wa isn't always feminine, depending on the context and the intonation. For example, できないわ, I can't do it, sounds feminine. But できないわ, I can't do it, doesn't sound feminine. And the non-feminine of saying wa is quite common these days, so don't be confused. Wa is quite special because most particles don't suddenly sound feminine or neutral depending on the intonation. For example, if you use yo, できないよ, できないよ. They're both neutral. The first one doesn't sound feminine. And just like wa, ze is also much more common with anime characters. So even though both anime characters and real-life Japanese people use some particles, anime characters often use them much more frequently. And that's one of the differences between the way anime characters speak and the way real-life Japanese people speak. Sometimes it's obvious when anime characters use particles that no real-life Japanese people use, but sometimes it's more subtle because some real-life Japanese people use these particles. Except that anime characters might use them more often or in situations that most real-life Japanese people wouldn't use. And these nuances are lost in translation, so if you want to fully understand not just anime but real-life Japanese, you need to learn Japanese, and if you want to learn Japanese with me, I will teach you the kind of Japanese that Japanese people today actually speak. So click the link and subscribe to my email group, Japanese with Yuta. Alright, see you guys soon. Ciao ciao!